So welcome to the Graph's Mission Control Testnet kickoff call for the Curators. Though the indexer portion of the testnet has been up and running for a few weeks, this is the very first Curator kickoff call. So welcome and thank you all for joining. My name is Tegan and I focus on all things business here at the Graph. The Graph is working to ensure blockchain data is open and accessible so that developers can truly build decentralized and serverless applications. As curators, the indexers will really rely on you to help them understand which DeFi and Web3 subgraphs to develop on. So thank you for being here. We're really excited to unveil what the Graph has been working on for the past almost 3 years now. This really is revolutionary technology, and we're excited to share it with all of you. So it is with my great pleasure to introduce our co-founder, project lead, and true visionary, Yaniv Tal.
Oh man, quite the intro. Thanks, Tegan, and thank you everybody for joining. Really appreciate you guys making the time to be part of this Curator program. And I know that many of you have full-time jobs and you have busy schedules. So we are getting close to launching our decentralized network, and we want to make sure that we get tokens into the hands of the community, and specifically the folks that have been building on the Graph and really in DeFi and Web3 more broadly. And we think that the initial token distribution should really be reflective of the contributions that everyone has made. And so that's part of our reasoning for putting this program together, is to make sure that people that have been building on the Graph, building in DeFi, building in Web3, have a chance to really get their contributions counted there. For folks that have already been very active, this Curator program could be pretty light touch. Just gives you a chance to learn a little bit more about the network before we launch. And maybe for people that haven't done that much yet, this is going to be a really great opportunity to contribute. So for today, I'm just going to start with some high-level motivation and vision setting. Then I'm going to pass it over to Brandon to go into some detail about the Graph protocol design. And then Tegan's going to walk you through some of the logistics for the Curator program. So, I believe that, we are just at the beginning of the next wave in crypto. Crypto tends to happen in cycles, and, we just made it through a pretty brutal winter. I think for everybody that's been working through 2018, 2019, even, early 2020, it was kind of a trying time. And, in a winter, I think people focus on survival. And so, you made it this far, and congrats for making it through. But as, it feels, at least, to me and to us, that things, are getting ready for another wave, that, we can open up our sights a little bit, into what it is that we're building. And I talk a lot about building a vibrant, decentralized future, because, that's really, what we're aiming for. And, that's really an idea that's existed in, really just in our minds up until now. The world that we live in is still, highly centralized, and, large corporations and governments. And, this idea of decentralization is really just a vision at this point. But we've made a ton of progress on the underlying infrastructure, tools, protocols, applications. And I think that in this next wave, this technology is going to become mainstream and ubiquitous. Maybe not, every single person on Earth, but it's going to go from being a toy and an idea to being real and tangible. So, we believe that Web3 is the next big platform, and that, in this next wave, tens of thousands of new protocols are going to get built. Hundreds of thousands of new decentralized applications are going to get built on top of those protocols, and that it's going to change, how people live their everyday lives. So I just want to, share, a few bits and pieces from my story that just kind of explain some of, my motivation and why I'm working on this. I was in college in 2008 studying electrical engineering when, the financial crisis happened. And, for those of you that lived through, the Great Recession, it was really like a kind of a wake up moment. And it was pretty scary. The economy, basically ground to a halt. And for somebody that was, studying in school, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get a job as an electrical engineer out of school, right? And I think that kind of an experience, that's like very impactful for someone. And I think throughout the country, for every job opening, there were like hundreds and hundreds of applications, and you would see these like long lines of people, trying to get these jobs. And part of the problem is that large corporations, centralized organizational structures are very slow and bureaucratic. There's a fixed number of seats. In order to get a job, you have to have the right resume, be able to interview well, be in the right location. And all of these things are limiting factors that gate opportunity, make it harder for people to, contribute their talents. My parents would always tell me that, you just have to play the game, right? That's the game. You have to get good grades, go to college, get good grades again, get a job at a good company, work your way up. And, for the longest time, that, was the game. But, right now we're facing another difficult time in the economy globally. Started by COVID, but really, I think, this period is probably, a ways coming. And I think, a lot of people are going to face the same types of challenges of like, how do I fit in this world? Where can I contribute my talents? How can I create the impact that I want to make? And there's difficult times, globally. I think democracies are struggling. Here in the US, the political process, has been almost entirely captured. It feels like we can't even pass common sense laws anymore. And the internet made, information and a lot of things much more accessible, but it also created a whole set of new problems, as, the applications running on the web, became centralized. And just generally, I think it's become difficult to know what you can trust online. And in general, people have the sense of, not being able to trust their institutions anymore. And so I think there are a lot of problems at a societal level that we need to tackle. And I believe that crypto and decentralization, is the solution to a lot of those problems. And what I've come to believe is that we are in the process of transitioning fully to the internet age. Our society that we were born into, that we've inherited, was really born around and structured around the industrial age, which was the previous technological age. And all of our institutions are really built for that time. And the internet just changed everything, right? It's a fundamentally new technology that just changes how information flows and how humans should cooperate and organize. But because the institutions haven't been reprogrammed onto that new technological foundation, there's this friction. And so what we need to do is rebuild new internet native institutions. And that's what protocols are. And that's what we're all working on. So, the game is going to change, and we all here working in crypto are going to have the opportunity to design the game and sub games and really define what it means to be an effective individual in our society. And the software that runs the economy, right, how we interact and organize society, that's like really, really important software. And that is why decentralization is so important, because that can't be owned by individual corporations. Right? That's not compatible with the free, open, democratic society. And so that software all has to run on provably neutral infrastructure. So that's what we believe. So now just want to show a demo of a DApp, right, a decentralized application that our team built and released a few months ago. And maybe just helps to kind of illustrate just where our head is at. So this is a DApp called Everest, and it's very simple. It's a project's registry. And we did our attempt of kind of grouping categories here that you could think of as really being just subsections of the economy. And we believe that the entire economy is going to move over to this open, public, shared neutral infrastructure. And so if you go back to 2008, looking for what kind of work you want to do in the economy, it would be really great to have that organized for you and to be able to explore and see all of the jobs and all of the economic activity, and have customized applications so that you can control how you want to interact with these different systems. So this was our kind of organization, and you can see, for example, we've got governance, and under governance you can see DAOs and voting tools, and we've got a bunch of projects, and these are all crypto projects that have been added here. And all of this is run directly on Ethereum. The UI is hosted on IPFS, and the data is indexed on the graph. So it all loads really quickly. So you can see DAO House here has been added by Ben, and you can see a description, the Alice browser, lots of different projects. And right now this is just very simple, but it already starts to show that you can build really beautiful product experiences on top of fully decentralized protocols. And so this idea that we have to wait a super long time to get great apps, I think is no longer true. Now, the graph is an indexing protocol for organizing all of this data. And we see ourselves kind of as being like a forcing function, because the graph only indexes data from decentralized protocols. So if you go to get data that isn't on the graph, what that means is that somewhere there's like a centralized point of failure that's not making that data available through an open, verifiable protocol. And so in this way, the graph becomes this kind of forcing function where you can really tell, did I build on top of open, public, verifiable infrastructure? And if not, then we should work on making that data verifiable and building the protocols for getting to consensus over that data. And so that's a process that we want to be working on with everybody, all of the indexers, all of the curators, to organize all of this, the crypto economy, make and really, make this a mainstream phenomenon. So, I'm really looking forward to working with everybody here. I think, we can go a lot further together than we can individually. And so, we want to get to know you guys, know what you're working on, know how we can help, and support you in your applications, in your protocols. And so really excited for this collaboration, and thank you for joining us on this journey. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Brandon, who's going to go in a little more detail about the graph protocol.
Thanks, Yaniv. Hi, everyone. Welcome again. I'm Brandon Ramirez. I'm a co-founder and research lead at The Graph. And like Yaniv said, I'll go through kind of the basic overall protocol architecture and economics. And since you guys are all joining as curators, I'll try and make it particularly relevant to you. So someone can give me a thumbs up real quick if they can see my screen. Perfect. So at its core, the graph is a decentralized market for outsourced indexing and querying. And you can almost think of every other mechanism that exists in the graph being in support of this core functionality of being a marketplace where end users, consumers, can pay a decentralized market of service providers for this particular service, which Yaniv has kind of described the value of at length. And I want to pause on this because it's worth noting that even though this is a pretty simple concept to describe, nothing like this has ever existed before at scale, right? Every other service that you use on the internet, you put a credit card in somewhere, usually it's the business putting in the credit card, maybe you're putting the credit card in with AWS, but here it's actually end users paying for the infrastructure that they're using, and that's part of what unlocks a lot of the benefits of decentralization and permanent infrastructure and permanent applications that we're trying to enable. So the things that are indexed on the graph are called subgraphs. And basically subgraphs are taking data from the blockchain and IPFS, and they're making that available to UIs via a GraphQL API. So this is kind of the basic protocol layering. The IPFS data that we index is anchored on chain. So all the data that's being indexed by the graph right now is data that has consensus behind it, coming from these open protocols. A subgraph is defined by a set of events that a subgraph is listening to. WASM mappings that deterministically process those events and load them into a store, and a GraphQL schema that defines the shape of that store. So all of these are contained in a subgraph manifest that's deployed to IPFS and identified by its unique content hash. So this is actually kind of the unit, this is the data sets that are being deployed to the graph. And as curators, this is what you'll be curating. So when a consumer comes to the graph, they basically use the on-chain service discovery layer to find indexers that can serve their queries. So before I said that the graph is a query market, it's more accurate to say that the graph is many query markets, because indexers will choose what subgraphs they want to index, for example, Uniswap, Synthetics, or Moloch, and then they'll be competing to provide the best service at the best price with the best security to the consumer that happens to be looking for that data. And so as a consumer or an end user is browsing the web, they might be actually participating in real time in dozens of different query markets depending on the particular application that they're trying to run. The graph does have a native token. Its ticker symbol will be GRT, and it's used for a host of functions within the protocol. I already mentioned settling query fees. It's also used for curator signaling, which we'll talk about in a second. This is what you'll be doing in the testnet. It's used for indexer staking. It's used for delegator staking, which will be familiar concepts to many of you. And we use it for indexer rewards as well, which is one of the benefits of having our own native token, is that we can reward activities through new issuance, which is kind of a unique power of a protocol having a native token. A little bit more on how these query market interactions take place. So I already mentioned that consumers use the on-chain service discovery layer. What they're doing is they're finding a set of indexers to ask for their prices and check their latency. Once the consumer, and there's a whole host of other attributes that they can look at, right? They can track their local reputation. They can look at their economic security that they're offering, so the amount that they have staked. It's really open-ended as far as what the consumer wants to pay attention to. The consumer, once they choose an indexer, then they send them a query along with a conditional micropayment. So this is sent via state channels in a construction that we designed, such that the micropayment is only unlocked when the indexer responds with an attestation that the query response is correct along with a query response. And so this is kind of the whole flow. This back and forth can happen numerous times. So, the indexer doesn't have to accept a payment. It could reject a payment. And the way that this is negotiated is using what we call a query cost model. So we have a tool that indexers use, codenamed Agora, but basically it lets indexers and consumers extract features of the GraphQL query and assign a price to that query. And so it's not just like a fixed price at the network level or even a fixed price per query that consumers are paying. It really is kind of a negotiation that's happening specific to the query that's being sent to the network. So as I mentioned, each subgraph is kind of its own market. But there's a question of what's going to actually bootstrap these markets to begin with, right? What's going to make an indexer who's looking at a brand new subgraph that's been deployed by who knows, by some anonymous user and say, you know what, I'm going to dedicate time and resources to index this subgraph, because these things are costly to index, right? Some subgraphs can, even index, over several days. And so this is where the curation market comes in. Its role is to provide a signal to indexers in the network that this subgraph would be valuable to index. You can kind of think of it as like a prediction market for valuable subgraphs. And so the way that it works is that curators signal graph tokens into a bonding curve that entitles them to shares that are minted by the bonding curve of curation rewards that are received by those curators. And the curation reward is simply just a portion of future query fees that are collected on that subgraph. So the more effective you are at choosing subgraphs to curate on that produce many query fees in the future, the more you would expect to earn as curators. And conversely, the better a service you're providing to the network, because you're helping indexers identify and allocate resources to the subgraphs that are going to provide the most value to the users of the network. The bonding curve we use behind the scenes is the Bancor formula bonding curve. So some of you will already be familiar with bonding curves from like AMMs like Uniswap, which use the constant product formula. There's some that use a fixed, just exponential or geometric function. I'm going to drill down on this just for a moment, because I think it is relevant to what you guys will be doing. We won't spend too much time in the math, but loosely speaking, what's happening when you're depositing funds into a bonding curve is that you're basically adding reserves into the curve. So you can think of the reserves as being the area under the curve. The x-axis here is the amount of shares that have been minted by the curve, and the y-axis here is the price. So let's say in this example that we're moving from the current price to this new price. The amount that you're depositing to get to that new price is this orange region under the curve, and the amount of new shares that you're getting are is this delta between the current shares and the new shares. Now, the way that rewards are distributed to curators, the way that you'll actually claim these rewards as curators in the network, isn't that some transaction is going to magically pay each curator individually, because that would be extremely gas inefficient. So the way that we leverage the Bancor formula is we actually deposit tokens directly into the reserves of the curve. And this wouldn't be possible with a normal, y equals x squared bonding curve. But it is possible with the Bancor formula, because they're defined by a reserve ratio that lets us, in this case, B represents the reserves. It basically lets us put reserves directly into the curve while keeping the overall shape, share distribution, and characteristics of the curve the same. So the way that you would claim your rewards as indexers is actually when this curve reaches a different state, because reserves have been added to it, you can withdraw your shares and you'll be actually getting a higher price for those shares than when you first minted them. So that's a little bit of how you can kind of think about the bonding curve that you guys will be signaling into. So as I said, the response that we expect from effective curation is to attract indexers to allocate stake towards specific subgraphs. So the way that that works is that indexers stake into the protocol as a whole. So once the GRT has been staked in the protocol, they can freely allocate it between subgraphs, and it can also be freely slashed as long as it's locked in the protocol, even if it was a fault on a different subgraph. When indexers want to actually serve queries on a subgraph, they allocate stake to those subgraphs to index and serve those queries. That's part of the service discovery layer that I mentioned in the earlier slide. So when consumers access the protocol, they'll be looking at what indexers have allocated stake to what subgraphs. And then that's kind of where they kick off the process of getting more information to decide what indexer to transact a query with. Indexers earn both indexer rewards, which are paid through new token issuance, and they earn query fees, which are paid through those micropayments that we talked about earlier. Indexing rewards real quick. We won't get too deep into the math here, but this is another area where the curator signal actually provides a direct incentive to the indexers, because the more curator signal that is on a subgraph, the more indexer rewards proportionally that subgraph will get in the network. And then that subgraph's indexer rewards are distributed evenly between the indexers according to, I should say proportionally according to their amount of allocated stake on that subgraph. And that's basically just what this formula is saying. I won't get too deep into the formal description. Query fees are paid actually not directly to the indexers, but once they're settled, they're paid via a rebate mechanism. Again, we won't get too deep into the weeds here, but the effect of this mechanism is that it encourages indexers to allocate stake in rough proportion to the amount of query fees that they're collecting. And that's helpful for consumers who are accessing the protocol, because then they can see that, indexers are encouraged to have a certain amount of economic security backing the queries that they're serving. And they can look at the amount of allocated stake on a subgraph as sort of an indication of that indexer's advertised capacity for queries on that subgraph. Finally, there's also a protocol fee. This is maybe more accurately, we should say a small tax on queries that are settled. And this is basically just to make it expensive to spoof query volume, right? Part of the design space here is to make sure that the market signals that are provided in the network are ones that folks can trust. So that's part of what curators do. But also indexers settling query fees is an important market signal. And it's one that we want to make slightly expensive to spoof, right? We don't want just indexers kind of paying the left hand with the right and, sort of pumping and dumping a subgraph, for example. Finally, we have delegation. So this will be familiar to many of you who have seen delegated proof of stake protocols. There's a pretty big design space even within delegation. So we kind of take an approach that's similar to Tezos in the sense that delegated stake is not slashed, but instead indexers have a delegation capacity that's a ratio of the indexer's own stake. So what that means is that for every unit of slashable stake, an indexer is allowed some amount of delegated stake that's not slashable. And that allows passive token holders who still want to participate in the protocol to help secure and add Sybil resistance to the protocol. But it also makes sure that the delegators don't have to have too much of a trust relationship with the indexers, right? So you can think of a trust relationship between a delegator and an indexer as sort of being a centralizing force, because there's only so many indexers that would maybe have the huge marketing budget and PR resources to build a brand around being trustworthy. So instead, we expect delegators to mainly look at an indexer's on-chain activities, but not require them to have sort of a trusted relationship with those indexers. So there's a market for delegation as well. So you can think of indexers as competing for delegators. One of the ways in which they do that is obviously providing a high quality of service, but another way they do that is by setting their delegation parameters. So the indexer can specify of the indexer rewards and the query fees that they receive that are attributable to their delegated stake. How much of that are they going to keep for themselves versus share with delegators? And you can kind of see the formula for that here. Basically, what the delegator is going to get is just the indexer rewards and the query fees after the indexer's cut has been taken out. So just to recap everything that I've talked about, it's often helpful for folks to see this kind of graphically. So you can kind of see, starting from, let's say, the right to left, you can see that indexers stake into the protocol as a whole. Delegators also delegate stake to indexers at that level. So delegators aren't delegating stake to specific subgraphs. They delegate to indexers, and those funds are available to indexers for all their allocation activities. Indexers then allocate that stake to specific subgraphs, and that's where rebates and indexing rewards are collected. You can see that the rebate pool has a control signal, that's the dotted line. And that control signal is the Cobb-Douglas function. That's the rebate formula I showed you earlier. That's a function of the query fees contributed as well as the amount of allocated stake. Similarly, the indexing rewards, as we discussed earlier, have a control signal of the amount of curator signal on a subgraph as well as the amount of allocated stake on that subgraph. And finally, on the left side, you can kind of see that consumers are paying query fees going into the payment channel settlement. Part of those fees are being distributed to the rebate pool, but part of them are going to curators to reward them for their activity of successfully predicting what subgraphs would be the most valuable in the network. One thing that I haven't touched on and that's not shown in this value flow is how these queries and indexing work is secured. So we have a mechanism for query and indexing, validation and slashing in the protocol. Right now that's based on an arbitrator that's set through decentralized governance. And the slashable offenses for that are the invalid attestations. So we talked about attestations before in the query market. In order to unlock a micropayment, an indexer has to provide an attestation. And so that means what they're providing actually is the means to slash them if that response is incorrect. Similarly, we talked about indexing rewards before. The way that indexers actually claim those indexing rewards is by supplying what we call a proof of indexing. So anytime an indexer closes an allocation and claims the indexing rewards on that allocation, they supply a signed digest of a bunch of messages that have been produced while indexing that subgraph since Genesis. And that is useful for basically uniquely attributable faults to the indexer during the indexing process. So if an indexer tries to claim indexing rewards but actually hasn't been doing the work of indexing, that is also a slashable offense. And those are both handled by the arbitrator, and the decision criteria for how indexers are slashed are defined by the protocol specification as well as an arbitration charter that gives the arbitrator some leeway if issues are due to software bugs that are not the result of malicious intent by the indexer. So to kind of wrap it all up, this is kind of just a high level architecture touching on many of the mechanisms that we talked about. You can see a lot of the mechanisms starting in the bottom left of this diagram are anchored in smart contracts that are running on the Ethereum mainnet. They're also supported and interacting by a number of off-chain services. So we have our state channel nodes, we have our arbitrator. We also have a subgraph availability oracle. So this is also set via decentralized governance, and it's to make it such that you can't claim indexing rewards on a subgraph whose manifest is not widely available on IPFS. And that's just to prevent certain economic attacks where, for example, you as a curator, you might curate a subgraph that doesn't exist, right? And then you might be the only indexer on that subgraph, and you might choose to just unilaterally collect indexing rewards on that subgraph. So that would be an attack where you act as both the curator and the indexer. The subgraph availability oracle makes that unprofitable. I should also mention since I didn't before, that there is a curation tax. So when you withdraw your shares from the bonding curve, there's actually a tax that's paid. So that incentivizes you to stay signaled on a subgraph for a longer period of time. That not only does that make these sorts of economic attacks unprofitable, but it also provides a better signal to indexers, right? Because as I said, indexers might be responding to your signal by spending several days of compute resources. And so we don't want you to be able to just kind of pump and dump and quickly enter and exit these bonding curves without some real conviction that, hey, this subgraph is something that indexers should dedicate real amounts of time to. Finally, you see kind of the indexing layer that we've talked about, and you can see that end users, will be running dApps and explorers that are accessing the graph, via a query engine that could be on their own machine or it could be hosted externally. And that's it for now. I think we've got more content on the testnet, but I wanted to pause to see if there's any questions, maybe a couple quick questions on what you've seen so far. Martin or Tegan, do we have anything in chat?
I think Eva's been doing a great job answering these questions that have come in chat. Eva, are there any outstanding questions that we should tackle now, or should we kind of move on and then tackle everything at the end?
Maybe here's a good one. So would curating a less used graph or subgraph be, but a cheap to index one, cost the same for the curator as a more expensive but less used subgraph?
So if I understand that correctly, the cost to curate a subgraph is not related to the cost of indexing a subgraph. Like there's nothing in the bonding curve that's aware of the cost to index that subgraph. But one thing you do need to be aware of is that the cost of indexing a subgraph could provide a disincentive to some indexers to index that subgraph. So it's possible that, a rationally motivated indexer would require there to be more signal on a subgraph if they could see from inspecting it that this is going to be a little bit more expensive to index than, let's say a cheaper one. So you might see that effect play out implicitly, even if it's not explicitly encoded into our smart contracts. So that's a great question.
Awesome. We also had a few questions about the withdrawal tax and just how we're setting the fees between curators and indexers, if you want to speak more to that process.
Yeah, so that's part of what we're experimenting with in the testnet right now, especially on the indexer side. We do have some rough defaults that we're starting with as our baseline. Those may not be final, but roughly we're thinking about 10% of query fees generated by a subgraph would go to the curators on that subgraph. In terms of the curation tax, it would also be close to 10%. And that's based on an analysis of basically what expected profitability of these economic attacks that I mentioned, and by basically setting an invariant where those economic attacks are unprofitable under realistic assumptions.
Okay, cool. Maybe just one, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question here about what's preventing someone from just deploying their own graph infrastructure to avoid paying fees. And the graph is open source software, and people are certainly free to run their own infrastructure if they want. Now we believe that the decentralized network and open markets are just the most efficient way of running infrastructure. Instead of having a single team that's responsible for running redundant infrastructure to make sure that they have good, fast, reliable service, you can have a whole network of service providers competing, and for them, they're running multi-tenant, so they can be serving lots of different subgraphs, lots of different applications, and they can really optimize. And so you just end up with a much better, cheaper service, and your users don't have to trust you, right? If you're running your own hosted infrastructure, you're this single point of failure, and users have to implicitly trust whoever's running those servers, whereas with the decentralized network, you get additional security guarantees.
It sounds like we have a few questions about the equilibrium that we would expect to form between, do we expect an equilibrium to form between the number of curators staking on a bonding curve and the traffic a subgraph will receive. Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of the dynamic that we're expecting, that, you know, initially when a subgraph is newer, you know, the signal is acting kind of as a prediction of future query volume. But over time, we would expect there to sort of be an equilibrium to be reached, where the market cap of, let's say, the shares that are on a specific subgraph would be equal to like the present value of the future query fees that would be generated on that subgraph. And so that's kind of where like the rubber meets the road on whether, you know, a particular curation decision has been successful or not successful. Is, does the query traffic materialize that you're predicting? I'll do one more. So there's one question about rationale behind withdrawal taxes versus time lock. That's a really great question, because in many analyses, like, these can be equivalent, right? You can look at the opportunity cost of a time lock as almost being like a form of tax. The main reason for not going with that approach is that it introduces a lot of extra bookkeeping into the smart contracts and makes things a lot less gas efficient. A tax is a lot simpler to reason about and implement. That being said, you know, we will be monitoring, you know, these parameters into testnet, and if we find that, you know, the tax that we start off with isn't, you know, healthy for the network, that's something that can be updated through governance or even in the initial protocol parameters. So why don't we cap it there?
Let's maybe just do one more question about, do you need to spend gas fees for each query? So, you know, consumers in the network will need to, you know, pay micropayments with their queries. So, you know, might just be a small fraction of a cent. You know, eventually, our goal is to have, you know, really great seamless wallet experiences for the state channels interactions, so that consumers can do that from their own devices. But early on, we expect gateways to abstract the payments away from the end users. And you know, the Graph team is going to release a gateway that makes it really easy for dApps or, you know, application developers to pay those fees on behalf of their users. So it'll be a really seamless experience.
And to be clear, in terms of actual gas, since our micropayments are happening off-chain using state channels, there's no gas fee for any individual query transaction. There are gas fees to load those state channels in the first place, to collateralize them, but that would happen far less frequently, and in many cases can be done off-chain. So with that, I guess we'll hand it back over to Tegan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, this portion of the talk will be to review what is expected of curators. So please get your notepad ready. So curators signal to indexers which subgraphs to index on, and as Brandon said, that signal is minted on a bonding curve. So what that means is the sooner that you signal, the more you'll earn. Creating a subgraph is permissionless, so anyone can create one. So that's, the indexers need your help as curators to identify which subgraphs to stake upon. And we need curators of all different skill sets. So, you know, hard tech skills to very soft business skills. We need everything in between. So I know the presentation Brandon shared was a bit technical, but don't worry if you're not as technical. We need your skill set as well. The main skill set of a curator is really to just be able to identify which data is valuable on the blockchain. You don't need to read code, you just need to kind of be able to understand that data. And so what is this data that I'm talking about? So when I say data, I'm talking about open blockchain data. So anything that's on chain, user balances, trade volumes, prices of assets, features of different NFTs, really anything that exists on the blockchain, in the blockchain ecosystem. And so an example is, you know, if because creating a subgraph is permissionless, anyone can spin up a subgraph. And so if I spin up a Uniswap subgraph and then Hayden spins up a Uniswap subgraph, well, you as the curators are going to signal that Hayden's subgraph, because he's from the Uniswap core team, is better than my subgraph. And then the indexers will stake on that. And another example is, you know, just it's basically just like finding alpha, just like how traders and VCs do. You're looking for alpha, and the sooner you find that, the sooner you find like an early DeFi subgraph, and you signal on that, the more you'll earn. So these are the rules. So write this down because the amount of GRT you'll earn in the Curator Testnet program is proportional to your contributions. So we'll be tracking this on our side, and there'll be many things that you do during the course of the testnet that will be accounted for in this score and in this amount that you earn. So there's no hacking. You'll be reporting bugs if you would like to, sharing modifications. You can also document data or processes here, and you can complete the different missions that we'll set out for you. Also creating content like blog posts, Twitter posts. Also, I saw a lot of folks in the chat just now answering a lot of each other's questions. And so that's also accounted for. In the Discord, if you help one another, you'll earn more. So these are the different phases. So curators must submit a form at the end of each phase. And this is a template that the graph team will provide to you. And this is where you'll be highlighting everything that you've done in this one form. So there'll be 4 forms that you fill out throughout this process. And then one of these, the first phase is Everest. So you need covered Everest. Everest is a decentralized project registry to make the decentralized web really tangible. And this lists out all projects in the space. I kind of like to compare it to a LinkedIn, just so you can kind of see all of the different projects that exist. The phase 2 will be evaluating different subgraphs. Phase 3 will be actually using and building these subgraphs. And then phase 4 will be learning more about curating. So creating tutorials about GraphQL, Web3 development, and much more. So these are the incentives. So the graph is allocating up to 3% of our total GRT supply, which is very significant. That's millions of dollars, millions of fiat dollars that we're allocating to you for your contribution during this phase. And so we'll have a bug bounty program that is separate from the testnet curation. So if you are technical, you're able to identify vulnerabilities, and then that will be rewarded. So the requirements, you need to join the Discord channel. This is where all of the graph team live. If you have any question at any point during the Curator program, the best place to ask is the Discord. There'll be an agreement that will be sent to you after this call. You'll need to sign that agreement to be eligible for these rewards. We will have a call just like this one every Wednesday of each phase kickoff. We anticipate that the phases will last between 1 week and 2 weeks. And then, as I mentioned, the forms will be required after each phase, and we'll use that for your scoring. And then we'll also have workshops and other user studies as well. These are the ways that you can contact us. So like I said, the Discord should be the main point of contact. We also have a Telegram that you can join. We have posted many, many different blog posts, so please read those. And then these are emails from the business team if you should need anything from us. If you have any roadblocks, please feel free to reach out to me. If I don't have the answer, I will find the answer for you. And then we ask that you invite all of your colleagues to the Curator program. This is going to be only open for a little while longer, so please make sure that everyone that you, ensure all of your friends are registered for this opportunity. And then list it in the form. If you do share this, we will take that into account as well. And then check out the Explorer. So over 2,900 subgraphs have been created by thousands of developers from projects like Aragon, Aave, Gnosis, Numerai, many, many others. So check that out, and also check out the playground to understand what querying really means. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them now.
I do want to tackle an offhand question from my earlier presentation. Someone asked, why was Africa turned off in the slide in one of the slides that I showed on the map? And there's actually a reason for that, which is it's a slide from a previous version of this presentation where we realized that if you go to Google Cloud, they have availability zones in every continent except Africa and Antarctica, obviously. Which just kind of highlights the need for a decentralized market of service providers, right? For a network like the Graph, as soon as there's demand for consumers to start querying in a, somewhere like Africa, like any service provider can come online and make it available in that region. But with the model that we're in now, where it's this kind of, winner take all centralized platform, you're kind of stuck with, and locked into the model that, you're building on. And so that's kind of the backstory for that slide. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Another question was, do we need to run nodes? So the answer to that is no. The indexers are the node operators in the graph network, and the curators just signal. So the indexers, it's a much more technical role. Curators, it's a much less technical role.
We had a question earlier that was about what is the criteria needed for subgraphs? How do you know what a high quality subgraph is? Maybe we can speak more to that.
Yeah.
We'll go into more detail about this, and we have an entire phase dedicated to evaluating subgraphs. If you are technical and you know how to read code, you can look at the source code. And this is part of the value of subgraphs in the first place, is that there's actually a lot of business logic that runs in building views on the underlying blockchain data, whether you're doing aggregations or making decisions based on events that have happened on chain. There are a lot of different ways that people could interpret that, and that's kind of what the subgraph developer is encoding. So if you can actually look at the subgraph code yourself and evaluate to see if they're actually calculating things correctly, then that could be an advantage to curating. Otherwise, you could compare things to Etherscan or different sources of data online, cross-reference, and just look at the responsive queries directly, make a decision that way. You could look at who's the developer that built the subgraph. So there's lots of different things that you could factor into evaluating the quality of a subgraph.
When you're using a really good dApp, if you don't know how to open Chrome DevTools, I suggest learning how to do that. And you can see all the dApps that are querying the graph, at least many of them that query it directly. Some go through a proxy server. So even if you're an end user and you're not that technical, but you know that a dApp that you really love and maybe is sort of under the radar is querying the graph, like you could help that dApp succeed, and even in some ways make the queries cheaper on that subgraph and for that dApp by going and signaling on the respective subgraph. So it's kind of a way of you incorporating your private knowledge, even as a user, to identify these up and coming subgraphs and dApps.
Great. Well, I know we are at the top of the hour. I know there are many more questions that you have, so please go to the Discord and ask them there. We are creating the Curator section of the Discord, so you can ask all questions there. Thank you so much for joining today. I know it's early, it's late in many parts of the world, so thank you so much for your time. And yeah, the distribution of the Graph Network has begun, so thank you for being a part of this and committed to this journey alongside of us. We will be sending an email after this call where we share the next steps, the KYC, the agreement, and then this video as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.